Nurture versus nature. Are some people born to kill, or are we taught to think like killers? With warning signs as early as 5, you'd think somebody would step in before 17 young men's bones were used as decoration, and their flesh used as meals. The Milwaukee monster was a nightmare walking before we even knew it, stalking clubs for 13 years only to be caught by a lone Polaroid. This is the story of the Milwaukee monster, or better known as Jeffrey Dahmer. Hey guys, and welcome back to my podcast. I'm your host Lulu, and today is episode 3 of the Jeffrey Dahmer case. Now, as you probably know, most of my cases are only 2 parts, and I knew when I first started researching this case that this was going to be at least a 3-part case. But I do think that we're going to be able to cover everything in just 3 parts. So if you remember, last time we left on that Polaroid picture, that really was the reason that Jeffrey Dahmer got caught. One vital mistake, and it all came crashing down. So when this officer noticed this Polaroid picture, and he got, not a good look at it, but he definitely could tell something was going on. It looked like to him, it was photos of dismemberment of bodies. And this man that was claiming all of these crazy things happened was enough evidence for them to search the home. And in July of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was finally arrested. During the raiding of his home, they found so many stomach-churning things, like that photo album that Jeffrey was putting all of his men's photos in. He had books, you guys, filled with these photos of these victims, filled with their dismemberment, with their naked bodies. He just had books full of them. And then they found all of the skulls. They found the painted ones and the unpainted ones, and the ones that he had previously prepped to be painted. 2 of these skulls actually sat right on Jeffrey's computer so that they could watch him while he worked. And just when they probably thought it couldn't get worse, they opened the freezer. And that's where they found the heads and the frozen body parts. And he had frozen food that was prepped and ready to eat scattered around his home. They found genitalia stored in jars. And they found a ton of evidence proving that he had already eaten some of these poor men. And to just seal the deal even more, in the corner of his bedroom, they found the huge 57-gallon bucket that he had used to melt the bodies down. And when they cracked it open, it had body parts from several of the men that were still breaking down. Upon further investigation, it came to light that the neighbors had actually complained multiple times about the smell coming from Jeffrey's apartment. And I guess when the manager of that apartment came and spoke to him about it, he would always have some sort of excuse that they would believe. One of those is that his freezer gave out and a ton of meat that was in it had actually expired and turned sour and had turned his whole flat so stinky. I don't really understand why they didn't go and check it out or warn Jeffrey, and they just believed all of these stories, because he had multiple phone calls, you guys. It was not just the one with the one excuse, but he always had an excuse every single time. Then it was brought up about that 14-year-old boy who had gotten away. Because the officer's responding, you have to write a reason as to why you responded. It's kind of like when somebody gets pulled over, they'll let you off with a warning. They usually have to write some sort of, at least if I'm, remembering correctly, they have to write some sort of explanation as to why they let you go and like what they pulled you over for and things like that. So they had a record about this 14-year-old boy that was naked and bleeding that the 2 officers had returned to Jeffrey. And of course, they knew exactly what had happened to this 14-year-old. And at least, those 2 officers that were involved were fired for not doing a proper investigation. But I don't know, guys. How would you feel if you were those officers, though? Like, yeah, they lost their jobs. They definitely deserved it. Like, they should have done an investigation. I cannot believe they walked a naked, bleeding boy back into a home when he obviously was not all the way there either. But imagine how those officers feel to this day, knowing that they walked this 14-year-old to his murder. During a thorough investigation of that apartment, they ended up turning 11 total victims. But after they spoke to Jeffrey, he ended up confessing to 17 murders, claiming they went all the way back to 1978. And of course, he confessed. They had so much evidence against him, it would be dumb to try to claim that you weren't guilty. Does that make sense? I mean, he was literally living in a home of horrors with rotting and decomposing bodies surrounding him. He had heads watching him. He ate people. He knew that there was nothing that he could do. He knew he wasn't getting away with it. But his legal team decided that they were going to try to use the insanity plea. Because, I mean, let's be honest, he's sort of crazy. You guys, he's sort of crazy. And when they were questioning him, and honestly in court, they asked him about his victims. They asked him, their names, what happened, where they met, just sort of wanted to know what happened. And when he would speak about these men, you could definitely tell that to him, they didn't mean anything. He was unemotional and dry, and he just didn't care. It was almost like he was reading a story. It didn't matter to him. These weren't people to him. They were just toys that he had thrown away when he was bored of them. And that's heartbreaking for these victims because they weren't. They were people. That's one of the reasons why when we started talking about them, I made sure to stress that this is not Jeffrey's number. We are not giving this to Jeffrey. These are his victims. These were real people. This is not just 17 people that he ended up, confessing to. These were real people. They're not a number. They were real people. And that's why we spent a whole episode on his victims, because they are people. But I do want you to just remember that all of this is coming from Jeffrey. These stories about what happened and where he met these people came directly from him, but we have some proof that he is most likely lying. One of his victims that got away responded to the court, obviously because he came up to testify, that he was not ever offered money. He was not ever offered to go have sex or these nude photos or anything like that. He only went over to hang out and have some free beers. That's literally what Jeffrey offered him, to come and hang out after the bar and have some free beers. And then Jeffrey just attacked him. So it really makes you think that maybe he never met any of these guys where he said he did. Maybe they did meet at a bar, maybe it was a gay bar, but maybe these men just came to hang out with Jeffrey and they just picked the wrong person to go and hang out with. And none of it was consensual. I mean, like I said, we only have Jeffrey's story. This is all off of what Jeffrey had said. But if in his mind being gay was still shameful, maybe that's why he twisted it that way about these other people. Maybe he was hoping that if all of his victims were gay and at gay bars and all this, that the courts would give him lesser of a sentence. And I mean, I don't know how true that is. That is just speculation, but I don't know if I believe Jeffrey at all. I mean, I believe him with the victims and who they were and how he killed them, but I don't know if I believe how he met them. To me, this man that came forwards in court and told everybody that he was never offered money for nude pictures or sex or anything like that, that is proof that Jeffrey is probably making a lot of it up. But it is also possible that this man that came forward is lying about how they met. I do know that, being gay at this time was really very hard to accept for some people. I mean, it still is, but it was like even more when this happened. And so maybe this man that got away didn't want his family to know like what was going on and that he was gay. And so maybe he did make it up. But I don't know. And honestly, the amount of drugs that he gave this man when he went to kill him didn't make a lot of sense either. At the point that Jeffrey had actually met this guy and brought him home to be murdered, he had killed a ton of people already. So he should have known how many drugs it would take to knock this man out. And I mean, maybe he was out or running low and just still decided to test it. But that doesn't really make sense to me, and I wonder if Jeffrey, in court especially, was really trying to play more of the victim card than the serial killer card, which with how many people he killed and how he did it, obviously wouldn't work out in his favor. To me, I honestly think Jeffrey enjoyed having his victims much more aware of what was happening. I don't think that they were completely out like Jeffrey claimed. I think that they were probably just drugged enough that they couldn't stop him. And with the one that got away, he just didn't give him enough. Which, if that's the case, that's another lie that Jeffrey has used, because he told them that they were all the way knocked out when he did all these things. But if they were more awake and aware of what was happening, I also don't think Jeffrey could have tried to plead insanity. I think that they would know that something was, I mean, they already knew that something was wrong, but that they would know that he's 100% not insane. But I mean, if he's lying about that, then who's to say he is not lying about how they met? Anyways, here's where we're going to move on to some of the trial and some of what happened. So on January 14th, 1992, Jeffrey entered a guilty plea with the reasons of insanity, which I can see how they would think that would get them farther, but honestly, you can tell straight up by all of the thinking and planning that he had to do with the murders and the disposing of bodies. If I was in that jury, would not have voted for insanity either, because you can tell that he had a lot of premeditation. He really did. Then, on February 17th, 1992, Jeffrey was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. And of course, the jury threw out that insanity plea. Thank God. Then Jeffrey decided to read a pre-written statement about how he was so sorry for all the pain that he had caused. And I've got a couple quotes for that. Quote unquote, "I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick. The doctors have told me about my sickness, and now I have some peace. I know now how much harm I have caused. I tried to do the best I could after being arrested to make amends." And then another one, quote unquote, "I now know I will be in prison the rest of my life. I know that I will have to turn to God to help me get through each day. I should have stayed with God. I tried and failed and created a holocaust. Thank God there will be no more harm that I can do. I believe that only the Lord Jesus Christ can save me from my sins." Yeah, okay, Jeffrey. Like, y'all, I think he was just trying to play us. I don't think he believed any of that, especially because it was pre-written, so. But that's just my opinion. I don't know. He then informed the courts that when the police were there this last time, they could have caught him about 6 months earlier than they ended up catching him, because if they would have searched his apartment, they would have found an altar Jeffrey had made and temporarily had out. It was made of skulls and bones from his victims, and it was actually designed to have a black leather chair for him to sit at. He wanted to make a huge altar of all of his victims to really just round out his home. But because he didn't have everything for it, like the chair, he decided to temporarily take it down. And probably because if men were to come to his house and see that, they 100% would have immediately fled. I mean, I would hope so. Now, when he was toted off to prison, he was very hated. There are a lot of reports from inside of the prison that he loved to make severed limbs out of his food, and he started to leave them around the prison so that other inmates would find them. And I don't know if this was a scare tactic or like a prank. I'm assuming with how he was at school, it was 100% a prank. But that quickly made him grow more and more less likable because he was kind of taunting everybody. Now here is where we're starting to wrap up, because we're at his, we talked about his sentencing, we're at his prison sentence and whatever. And here is where we enter a man named Christopher. He arrived at the same Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution about the same time that Jeffrey did. And when he met Jeffrey, he claimed that he immediately knew that he did not like him and he did not want to get close to him. He was going to keep his distance. And it was kind of obvious to everybody to kind of stay away from him because Jeffrey had a prison escort of at least one guard at all times. And that's because of how hated he had become at this prison. They were kind of protecting him. Now, I just want to clarify that even the guards hated him. Nobody liked Jeffrey. And it's because of some of what he did, and also because he was just kind of a crazy asshole. Nobody liked him. And that's where we are moving into the end of Jeffrey Dahmer. And guys, it was a beautiful one. They have Christopher quoted in saying he crossed the lines with so many people. Prisoners, guards, prison staff. And what had happened was Jeffrey, Christopher, and a third inmate named Jesse were left unchecked together for about 20 minutes. They were doing their daily cleaning. Christopher, who was 25 at the time, had just grabbed his mop and was in the process of filling the bucket with water when he felt somebody poke him in the back. When he turned around, Jeffrey was standing there with Jesse and they were laughing. Now, one of them had poked him and they just thought it was hilarious. At first, Christopher decided to ignore it and the three ended up splitting up to clean. Christopher followed Jeffrey towards the staff's locker room, and that is where he decided to grab a 20-inch, 5-pound bar from the weight room. It was time to confront Jeffrey. He asked Jeffrey if he had really killed all of those people. And Jeffrey just responded with a simple yes. And Christopher says at that point he could tell Jeffrey got scared. He started quickly looking for the door so that he could leave and not be left alone with Christopher. And Christopher blocked him off. And with 2 swings of the bar, he crushed Jeffrey's skull in. It did turn out he was still alive when they rushed him to the hospital, but he died on his way from multiple skull fractures and a brain trauma caused by the bar. Then, when Christopher was done with Jeffrey, he decided that he was just as fed up with Jesse. He crossed the gym, of course looking around to see if there was any officers close because they're not supposed to leave Jeffrey alone. Without seeing anybody, he entered the locker room where Jesse was cleaning. And Christopher claims that pretty much the exact same thing happened. He hit him over the head with the bar and crushed his skull in. Jesse also died in the hospital on November 30th. Now, Christopher and a couple of the other inmates felt like all of this was done on purpose. Nobody liked Jeffrey. Even the guards. They did not like Jeffrey. They think that they left them alone for a reason that day, and they didn't come back until it was too late for a reason. The guards were just as fed up with Jeffrey and wanted him gone as everybody else. And unfortunately, I guess not unfortunately, because technically Christopher did murder 2 people, they did have to charge him. So, during his trial, he started pleading the insanity plea to the murders. But later he decided it was best to change it to no contest. So they ended up transferring him, and he was sentenced with 2 more life terms, on top of the current life term he was already serving for actually killing his former boss while he carried out a robbery. We're just going to input that little side story because I think it's kind of interesting to know. Christopher had gotten fired from a job. It was a training program at the Wisconsin Controversial Corps. He was so upset about being fired that he started drinking very heavily. And that is where he was beginning to hear voices, and they were telling him that he was the chosen one. And one day he just decided to listen to these voices, I guess. And he returned to his former job site with a pistol. He walked right up to that site manager, whose name was John Fian, I believe is how you say it, and demanded cash. Now, John only had $15, which he gave him, but that made Christopher super mad because he was expecting more. So he decided, instead of, shooting the person he was mad at, which was John, which he shouldn't have shot John anyways, he turned around and shot a man named Stephen Lohman. He shot Stephen 2 more times before John was able to knock the gun from his hands, which led Christopher to run off. But of course, because this is his former job, they knew who it was. They knew who had attacked and shot them. And when the cops found him, he was sitting on top of his current girlfriend's apartment building. And of course, he got charged. Jeffrey Dahmer couldn't be alone. He didn't want to be alone. And so he did the only thing he could think of to always have somebody with him. Murder, and to eat them so they could never choose to leave. The Milwaukee cannibal story will take your breath away and leave you with a smashing blow of reality, just like Jeffrey. This podcast should not be taken as fact due to its risk of containing false or misleading information. All information shared has been researched to the best of my abilities, but accidents do happen. If this is a story you are interested in learning more about, I highly recommend doing your own research. You can visit me at my website, confessedobsessed.com, for a list of my sources and to suggest your own case. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.